Welcome to the debate. Imagine you run a multi-million-dollar business. Your books have closed perfectly for 40 consecutive quarters.
The absolute dream, right?
Right, exactly. Your internal reporting is flawless. And yet, the very moment you hand your data over to a tax authority, they tell you that your entire financial architecture is, well, structurally unsound.
Yeah, it's a terrifying wake-up call for a lot of companies.
It really is, and that is the terrifying reality of the standard audit file for tax, or as it's commonly known, SAF-T.
We're not talking about standard compliance returns here.
No, definitely not. Standard returns give you the luxury of aggregation. A standard value-added tax, or VAT, return just summarizes your transactions over a specific period. An e-invoice represents a single billing document. But SAF-T demands a machine-readable, mathematically precise blueprint of an organization's complete financial record.
Every single detail.
Yes, every transaction, every tax classification, and every account movement across your entire general ledger.
Right. And because SAF-T requires that absolute atomic level of detail, it operates as a highly intrusive diagnostic tool. Standard compliance obligations allow you to extract a defined, limited slice of data from your enterprise resource planning system, your ERP.
Right.
If your underlying data architecture is messy, standard returns don't really care, as long as the top-line numbers match. But SAF-T does not afford you that luxury. It asks for everything, and it expects everything to connect perfectly.
Which exposes the central question we are tackling today. When an organization attempts its first SAF-T extraction, it inevitably reveals deep structural flaws in their historical data.
Always.
So, is this revelation a mandate to fundamentally overhaul your core financial data architecture? From my perspective, SAF-T is the ultimate forcing function. Because it demands absolute completeness and internal consistency, data quality problems that were previously invisible suddenly become glaring structural errors. If you try to fix this data downstream, in what we call the extraction layer, basically just patching the file right before you send it to the government, you are merely masking the rot.
Wow, masking the rot. That's a strong way to put it.
Well, it's true. True compliance requires fixing the source data to create a canonical data model. That is essentially a single, unified language that every system in your company agrees to use, so an invoice generated in France looks mathematically and structurally identical to an invoice in Poland.
I hear that, but treating a compliance diagnostic as a mandate for an enterprise-wide architectural overhaul, it just ignores basic operational realities.
How so?
Well, think about re-engineering an organically grown ERP, one that might span dozens of countries, multiple legacy systems, decades of acquisitions. Doing all that just to map to a specific jurisdiction's statutory SAF-T taxonomy is, frankly, a massive overreaction.
I wouldn't call structural integrity an overreaction.
But building transformation rules in the extraction tool is a highly effective, totally valid way to shield the business's operational systems from the rigid, constantly shifting demands of tax authorities. Pragmatic compliance delivery requires accepting a certain level of technical debt just to keep the business running.
But see, the idea that internal reporting is working quote-unquote fine is an illusion, and SAF-T shatters it immediately. Let's look at exactly what this file exposes when you run that first extraction. Take unmapped accounts.
Okay.
An organization's chart of accounts is almost always extended organically, right? Accounts get added for convenience by a local finance team, they get renamed without being properly reclassified, or they're inherited from legacy systems during corporate mergers.
Sure, that happens all the time in the real world.
Right, and when you run SAF-T, the schema demands a rigidly standardized statutory taxonomy. Every single account must be definitively tagged as an asset, liability, equity, revenue, or expense according to the government's rules.
Right.
Suddenly, you have hundreds of internal accounts producing nonsensical errors because they cannot be automatically mapped to the tax authority's standard.
Which is exactly why mapping them in the extraction layer makes perfect operational sense. You don't rewrite the internal chart of accounts that your management team relies on. You translate it.
Fixing data in the extraction layer is like having a crack in your car's engine block, and instead of welding the metal, you just reprogram the dashboard warning light to turn off.
I'm not sure that's a fair comparison.
It absolutely is. The dashboard looks clean to the tax authority, but the engine is still leaking oil. SAF-T requires complete information for every single transaction: legal name, registration number, tax identifier.
Yeah, but
In most ERP environments and customer relationship management systems, your CRM, fields like a domestic customer's VAT number or a registered business address, they were deliberately made optional 10 years ago to speed up transaction processing. If a domestic customer lacks a VAT number in the CRM today, no extraction tool can magically invent it. You have to go back to the source.
okay, but pulling the engine block out stops the car for 6 months. If you were a compliance officer listening to this, your blood pressure probably just spiked thinking about going back to the source.
I mean, sometimes surgery is necessary.
Well, let's look at the actual operational cost of retroactive data remediation across every historical transaction in an audit file scope. You are asking compliance teams to contact vendors and buyers to track down years-old missing registration data.
Yes, because it's required.
And you are asking them to halt current sales workflows, to update ERP master records that haven't been touched in a decade. Doing that while staring down a strict 30-day regulatory mandate deadline, that will paralyze a business. Using default values or mapping tables in the extraction layer is the only way organizations can meet these deadlines without grinding their commercial operations to an absolute halt.
Okay, let's make this tangible. Imagine you bought 500 office chairs 10 years ago for a regional branch.
All right, I'm imagining it.
The internal reporting says furniture expense, $50,000, and the month-end close is clean. Everyone is happy. But SAF-T looks at that entry and asks, where's the original purchase order? Who was the vendor? What was their tax ID? What was the date of supply?
Well, sure, it asks for the details.
Suddenly, what was a perfectly clean internal ledger looks to the tax authority like you just threw $50,000 into a black hole. Missing VAT numbers are just the tip of the iceberg, though. Even if you magically find all those missing IDs, you still have to explain how your transactions actually connect to each other. And then this is where a SAF-T gets truly brutal. Broken document reference chains.
The reference chains are complex. Yes, I'll give you that. But they are a perfect candidate for an extraction layer solution.
They are a nightmare. The SAF-T schema requires a complete audit trail that mathematically links transactions back to their originating business events. You need the original purchase invoice reference on an accounts payable posting.
Right.
You need the sales order number attached to the revenue posting. You need the payment reference tied to the clearing document. In legacy systems where human users have applied their own manual data entry conventions over the years, these chains are entirely broken.
Which is exactly why we use software to fix them.
But you end up with standalone accounts payable entries completely disconnected from the original purchase documents. A human auditor might be able to manually trace them, but a machine-readable XML file will just flag them as orphaned anomalies.
So how does an extraction layer actually handle this?
It uses heuristic logic.
Oh, heuristics. Yes, heuristics. If there is an orphaned accounts payable entry, the extraction tool can be programmed to look back exactly 3 days in the database, find a purchase order for the exact same dollar amount from the same vendor, and automatically stitch those two documents back together for the regulatory file.
That's just guessing.
It translates the messy operational reality into a compliant one. You don't need to retrain 1,000 employees on how to manually enter AP data. You let the software build the bridge.
You aren't building a bridge. You're building a mathematically perfect fiction.
Oh, come on.
Now, really, if you force an accounts payable entry to stitch to a purchase order using heuristic guesswork, you are handing the tax authority a story that isn't actually reflected in your core database. And let's look at text code proliferation.
Okay, let's look at it.
Over 10 years, a company might accumulate hundreds of obsolete tax codes. If you use transformation rules to mask an orphan tax code, a code used historically but no longer defined in your active master data, aren't you essentially lying to your own internal analytics while telling the quote-unquote truth to the tax authority?
The premise that we are lying to internal analytics fundamentally mischaracterizes what an extraction layer does.
Does it?
Yes, the internal reporting was tolerating this imperfect data without visible consequence for years. The ERP month-end close had been clean for consecutive quarters.
But it wasn't actually clean.
Data that is well maintained internally is classified according to internal organizational conventions. A chart of accounts organized around internal management reporting won't natively map to a statutory SAF-T classification.
Right, which is the problem.
Tax code descriptions might use internal terminology rather than the regulatory taxonomy. This isn't fundamental data corruption. It is a classification alignment issue. An agile extraction layer functions as a translator.
A translator?
Yes. It takes the internal reality, which successfully runs the business, by the way, and translates it into the regulatory reality without disrupting operations.
When different users in different corporate entities apply tax codes inconsistently to the exact same economic event, that is not a translation issue. That is an internal inconsistency that a tax authority's automated analytical systems will immediately flag as an audit risk.
Well, there are always outliers.
Let's talk about period boundary inconsistencies. What happens when your opening and closing balances diverge because of retroactive adjustments made by the accounting team or messy system migrations? You write a technical rule to force your balances to match in the SAF file, but your actual internal bank accounts don't reflect that forced balance.
It's an alignment.
You aren't just creating technical debt, you are handing the government an XML file that doesn't match the reality of your corporate treasury. When they audit you, and the whole point of SAF-T is that they will audit you algorithmically, that fiction falls apart instantly.
That assumes the extraction rules are poorly written.
It assumes the auditor asked to see the underlying source data that generated the file, and the numbers don't match. In the next compliance cycle, your extraction layer becomes infinitely more complex because you have to maintain the logic of last year's fiction alongside this year's new data. You are stacking workarounds on top of workarounds. If you fix this at the source, you stop the bleeding.
A canonical data model, a perfectly unified global architecture where every user flawlessly enters data, is a beautiful theoretical concept.
I sense a but coming.
But it assumes a static environment where business rules never change and where IT budgets are infinite.
No, it assumes a disciplined environment, a maintained, standardized chart of accounts, where a finance manager cannot physically create a new account without assigning it a valid statutory classification.
That's a lot of red tape for a finance manager.
It's enforced document reference standards, where reference fields in financial documents are hard-coded as mandatory in the CRM, so a user cannot click Save without entering the VAT number.
Right.
A period-end close that actually produces mathematically reconciled opening balances. Organizations that do this find that SAF-T becomes progressively simpler every single year. The extraction layer approach guarantees that SAF-T remains an annual crisis. You perform the exact same emergency heuristic remediation every single cycle.
It doesn't have to be an emergency if the transformation rules are well maintained. The extraction layer handles the exceptions systematically.
Sure, systematically kicking the can down the road.
You write the rule once. If tax code A appears in legacy system B outputs statutory code C, the software runs it automatically every month. The business continues to function without a multi-million-dollar ERP overhaul.
But the regulatory horizon is expanding rapidly, which makes the extraction layer approach increasingly unsustainable. Look at the global footprint.
Okay.
SAF-T was originally developed by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. Its adoption has spread from Portugal through Poland, Romania, Norway, Austria, France, and Lithuania.
Right. It's everywhere.
We're seeing it drive the European Union's broader VAT in the Digital Age initiative. Digital financial reporting is becoming a near-universal, real-time obligation. If you fix the source data, you create a foundation that supports cross-entity analytics, automated matching, and future global digital reporting. You build an architecture that scales across borders.
A canonical architecture is a theoretical fantasy in a global business, precisely because of that expanding footprint.
Wait, how does an expanding footprint make a unified architecture a fantasy?
Because yes, the OECD developed the baseline standard, and yes, it is spreading globally, but every single jurisdiction implements it differently. France has its own highly specific schema.
Well, sure.
Poland has the JPK standard, which has its own localized nuances and data demands. Romania has its own unique requirements. the specific schemas differ wildly from border to border.
They have variations, yes.
Trying to build a single universal source architecture to satisfy all of these localized, constantly shifting taxonomies is an impossible moving target. The moment Poland updates its taxonomy or Austria changes a specific data requirement, your canonical core ERP is suddenly out of compliance.
The schemas differ, yes, but the underlying data quality requirements are absolutely consistent. Every single tax authority wants complete business partner data, properly classified accounts, and mathematically referenced transaction records.
But if you try to retrofit your core global ERP for every local statutory change, you are subjecting your entire global IT infrastructure to constant localized heart surgery.
Heart surgery?
Yes, every time Romania updates a field requirement, you have to open up the global ERP code. An extraction layer allows the organization to handle regional nuances precisely where they should be handled, at the edge.
I see what you're saying, but...
You maintain the stability of the global ERP for your core operations, and you use the extraction tool to manage the specific regional complexities for France, Poland, or Norway. It is a mature architectural division of labor between your IT department and your tax department.
But if the data simply does not exist, you cannot divide the labor. The extraction layer cannot map a void. SAF-T takes fields that transaction processing made optional and retroactively makes them mandatory.
True.
By treating this purely as an edge problem for the tax department to solve in isolation, organizations miss the opportunity to realize the massive operational benefits of source-level data governance.
Meaning what?
When you enforce document reference consistency at the source for SAF-T, you simultaneously enable the continuous reconciliation that your own treasury team needs. When you verify business partner data at the point of entry, you get better counterparty risk management for your procurement team. It pays back in dimensions far beyond the compliance obligation.
Look, cleaner source data is inherently better. No one argues against good data governance. The issue is sequencing, proportionality, and reality.
Okay.
If an organization has a 2-year strategic roadmap for an ERP cloud migration, forcing them to conduct a massive master data cleanup on a legacy on-premise system just to satisfy a near-term SAF-T mandate is a profound misallocation of resources.
But you have to comply.
And the extraction layer bridges that gap. It allows the business to survive the audit file submission while planning a more strategic long-term architectural shift on their own timeline. You do not let a tax authority dictate your internal IT roadmap.
That assumes the temporary bridge doesn't become a permanent crutch.
It shouldn't.
But what we consistently see in the enterprise space is that once the immediate compliance crisis is averted via extraction workarounds, once the dashboard warning light is turned off, the strategic architectural shift gets deprioritized. It's corporate nature.
Well, budgets are tight.
Exactly. Why spend $10 million fixing the core when the extraction tool is generating an acceptable XML file? SAF-T ends the comfortable ambiguity of financial data. It tells you the exact truth about your architecture. By using it as a forcing function, you secure the executive mandate to fix root causes that have been accumulating technical debt for a decade.
While ensuring the company can actually function in the meantime. The primary duty of an enterprise is operational continuity.
Agreed. Treating an incredibly intrusive regulatory diagnostic as an immediate mandate to restructure your general ledger is reckless. Extraction layer transformations, when managed as a strategic capability rather than a panicked workaround, provide the protective buffer an enterprise needs to operate in a highly fragmented, aggressive regulatory landscape. It shields the business from the volatility of tax authorities. Well, both of those realities are currently playing out across the enterprise landscape right now. Companies are spending millions trying to rewrite their core, while others are building incredibly complex webs of extraction logic. Regardless of the approach an organization takes, I think we can both agree that SAF-T produces an uncomfortably honest view of data quality.
Oh, absolutely. The initial validation results are always a startling revelation for enterprise compliance teams. There really is nowhere to hide when the entire general ledger is laid bare in machine-readable XML.
It strips away all the assumptions we make about our operational systems. The internal reporting might look beautiful, but SAF-T shows you the actual plumbing.
Yep. It forces us to look at compliance not just as a legal checkbox, but as a mirror reflecting the structural health of an organization's data. As the landscape of global digital financial reporting continues to shift from monthly batch files to near real-time transaction reporting, there is undoubtedly much more to explore in how governance intersects with regulation.
Definitely. The technical demands from these tax authorities are only going to increase, whether we manage them at the core database level or at the edge of the network. The days of simply summarizing a VAT return and hoping for the best are completely over.
Completely over.
It brings us back to that fundamental question of structural integrity. When the inspector asks to see the wiring inside the walls and points out that your circuits are dangerously crossed, do you quickly patch the drywall with an extraction layer and hope it holds through the audit? Or do you take the opportunity to finally rewire the building so it doesn't burn down? We will leave it up to you to decide whether compliance should dictate internal data architecture or whether it's best managed as a protective external layer. Thank you for joining us on the debate.